Okay, we're going to start off the podcast. I'm going to put up my information and I'm going to put that right into the chat. For anybody who donates a Patreon with it, there's basically if you donate to the top two levels with it, the top, once we reach at least a few people with it, the top level will be giving away a Roman Byzantine era coin with it once we reach to it, that level. And the second level will be giving away a Roman silver coin once we get to their level of at least a few people. I think I calculated out at least like 5 people who donate, and that'll basically help me pay for some things with that I need to help sustain this with it. As we start to develop other things with it, I'll start adding on other types of giveaways and stuff for the lower levels. But that's what I have right now planned. As with people who do it with it, I would have to get your information with it so I know who's actually going in there. And from that point on with it, we'll just go into our actual point with this. With this, we're talking about basically the point of climate change being, frankly, religion, and why it's becoming more and more troublesome. Now, at first with it, it was basically on being a platform on the Democratic Party or liberal parties along the Western world, and basically using it basically stating that those who don't believe in it, they're going to shame those who don't, and that was basically about it. But now it's gotten into some disturbing factors with it. Because at first with it, it was they're going over some factors that were based on which you could tell it was a religion by using things such as consensus. Now, we obviously know on science has no consensus. It's either fact or it's not. There's no such thing as consensus in science. This isn't a poll. They don't poll people on, oh, is this going to cure this disease, like let's say cancer or whatever type of disease you want to put up there. They don't poll people if they think it's going to do that. That's not how things work in science. They don't poll on what it called, if this is an actual new discovery. That's not how things work in science. Either it's fact or it isn't fact. Either because if we were to base things based on consensus, they would basically still be thinking that the Earth is flat, when we obviously know that it is a spherical-like shape. Obviously, it's not fully spherical because we have topographical maps that show it does have alterations on its surface. We know it's not a full sphere. Those who think it's a full sphere are not exactly right, just as much as those who still think the Earth is flat. And but it should be considered the same way with those who think that we need that science can be done with consensus. No, science is not a poll. This isn't a political poll. You're not electing scientific theories. I mean, if so, with it, we could basically, if we got enough votes, we could repeal the law of gravity, and everybody'd float off into space. Frankly, that's not the truth, and that's absurd to think so. And we need to understand that basically science is either fact or it's either can be proven or it can be disproven. And if we're talking about theories with it, if they can't be proven, and if events past the point from when the theory has been produced have disproven it, we need to start looking at the idea that these are actually looking out to be false. Now, when they try to state that, when you try to look at something and they try to state, oh, this is consensus means it's science, that means you're starting to look into the fact of a religion. And that's why we're talking about this as an actual religion and not as actual science. Because we're starting to get into it to where it looks more like uh, one of these weird type of remote religions that ends up doing some really obscure acts, and you'll see why in a minute. Number one is we have the statements of Bernie Sanders coming down as one of them, and you'll see why that's very, very disturbing to begin with. Now, the statements of Bernie Sanders should be viewed as something very disturbing, and he was stating that these poor nations, that we should basically be exporting out abortion out to these poor nations, uh, filled with like basic minority people, basically out to like Africa and out to areas of Asia, to these poor areas. And basically what he's stating is eugenics. Basically wipe out these people through essentially what is called soft eugenics, which is using birth control and abortion. And essentially, he's using the statement saying that, oh, we're at the point of overpopulation. Now, anybody who realizes we have plenty enough food globally, what's the actual problem is the distribution thereof. And where the problem exists is when people go and they start protesting and they say, "Oh, we can't use this area for farming," and uh, they start they start not thinking about industry and how industry wants to use farming. Well, the fact is we have plenty of areas in the city we can use farming for, and we can use rooftop areas with it, such as that. So there's plenty of area for that. It's just we have a lot of these elite people that want their area for their bike paths. And it goes back onto this very disturbing religion. They don't want these poor people to exist. They don't want to see them. So the idea is to get rid of them. And this is an easy way to get rid of them by just killing them off, and not doing it basically hands on, just doing it through a soft way. And this is what their idea was. They would be viewed as not as controversial as rounding them up and shooting them. This is why they did this through the idea of abortion and birth control. Why it was put toward blacks and other minorities. Why the Birth Control League, which is now known as Planned Parenthood in the United States, why this was actually put forth. And this is why Margaret Sanger did not like minorities. She felt them to be an inferior stock of human people. And if you even go back to other eugenics groups, they even put a black boy in a zoo to actually and put him in a cage with, I believe it was a gorilla, to prove that that he was actually a what it called a derivative thereof, that to prove that blacks were basically the missing link. And this was the actual point that what eugenics was trying to prove, was that they were a lower life, was that minorities, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, certain other European stocks were actually lower levels than certain other European stocks of people. And this was meant to actually on their end prove a point that they were actually lower classes of people. And this was, as you would have guessed, it goes back to National Socialism, and it goes back to ideas of the KKK, which was basically the militant arm of the Democratic Party. And when we look at this, we need to understand those facts. We can't ignore them. These are honest facts that have always been there. And Margaret Sanger had what it called had radio contact, and was actually the one who inspired the German Socialist Workers' Party, which is under uh, leader Adolf Hitler, that to actually do what they did out there with the Holocaust in Central Europe. And we need to understand that, and that's what needs to be understood about what was going on with that. Now, this is basically what this idea is people need to understand democratic socialism and national socialism are identical, because basically is to be elected in any one of these countries with socialism, you're going to have to be elected, and in any type of democratic process. It doesn't matter if it's based on a republic or if it's based on parliament. You're going to have to basically be elected in some sort of manner. There's no direct democracies out there, obviously, but there's what it called. We have republics and we have parliamentary systems out there, and this is where they basically get themselves elected. So using the term democratic really is irrational. If you look at their actual standpoints, you'll actually see that they're that all these groups are very, very nationalistic. That means national socialism. If you look at their actual backers, you will see the National Workers' Party. And these National Workers' Parties are socialist groups. That is National Socialist Workers' Party. That is the Nazi Party. And nobody ever bats an eye about that, and that's what needs to be understood when nobody. These groups are usually teachers groups and other groups like that. No one's ever looking at that and ever saying anything about it. And these are Nazis. If you want to talk about anything about it, this is your Nazi group, and the Nazi group is not on the right. It was never a right-wing group because that would be conservatism. Your only conservative groups that would be anywhere closer neoconservatives, and that's actually linked to Trotsky, which is actually closely linked to Stalin, which is a communist group, which is actually a communist, not a socialist. Socialists believe in basically a form of fascism to overtake the government. Communists believe in overtaking the whole economy. Now, in the case of neoconservatives, they believe in basically using it through militarism to overtake the system, and they tend to leave the economic side alone, but they're more than willing to, if they have to deal to get their militarism going, they will be willing to bend as far as they have to on the economic side to get their militarism going, and that's what ends up going with it. But really, when it comes to the economic side with it, they really are not really concerned. What we have here with it is basically a group of basically democratic socialists or national socialists, whatever you want to call them. And that's what's really happening. That's why when you talk about people like what Bernie Sanders is saying, Bernie Sanders is basically talking the same type of statements that you would find out of the mouth of Adolf Hitler. And instead of using the term Jews, he's using the term poor people, targeting poor nations within. This is the idea of it, and we've already put our stamp on trying to put groups like Planned Parenthood out there. And guess what? They've actually been rejected because they're not trusted for a good reason. And most of these groups are eventually kicked out because of that fact, or highly limited because of that fact. That's why Planned Parenthood prefers to actually work in bigger Western countries, because there's more money there, number one. And number two is the fact is they can actually get business going there because the reputation seems to be better. Now, when we look at the other troubling fact that we need to examine, this is actually, I believe it was a Swedish climate scientist. I put climate scientist in what I call quotation marks, because the fact is no legitimate scientist would even suggest such a thing, and this is basically suggesting that we should be getting used to, because they claim that we're at a verge of overpopulation, which is actually a bunch of garbage, because to claim that, we would actually have to look at food supplies, and we can see the food supplies are not in shortage. What we have in shortage is actually the actual chains and the limitations that are being put forth to stop the actual growing of food. I mean, we're even having governments around the globe that are basically saying, oh no, we will actually pay you not to grow food in these areas to rise the actual prices of food. Now, when you look at that, that should tell you right there that we do not have an actual shortage of food. This means we actually have the ability to make an abundance of food. And that the actual issue is we have governments trying to use it for price controls instead of letting the farmers actually control what they want to actually grow, and not telling them they have to be limited, and basically the government stealing the farmers. In many cases, if the farmers do grow too much, stealing the farmers' property and basically setting it out in the middle of the field to rot, just to raise the price of those goods. And this is even in your Western countries that believe in so-called capitalism. It's because they still live in a society that believes in price controls. You'll find this in the West, such as the United States. The United States still does many price controls on food, and they're doing this essentially to buy more votes from those groups. Now, when we start looking at the factor of what this actually does, is this means that you can't get food out to the people as much, and then you also have attacks on the ability for fuel, such as you get people stating that they don't want new ideas such as fracking to be used, such as Elizabeth Warren. She says she wants to shut down fracking even on private lands, which would be a little bit of a laughingstock, because she technically couldn't, because that would be essentially a violation of people's private property rights. And the only issues that we've had with fracking is the normal issues you're going to have with anything. When they showed the little thing of basically being able to have a flame come out of a sink, that's basically when you if you're going to run water hot enough from a sink, it's going to eventually create enough, or if it's running fast enough through a sink, it's still going to cause the water to separate. When you have water separating naturally, you get basically oxygen and hydrogen. Hydrogen is flammable, so it doesn't matter what you're doing with it. It will do that even if you're not fracking in the area. You can go out to an area that doesn't have fracking, and basically you're going to find the same situation. So when they do that little trick, that actually has nothing to do with fracking or even any standard oil production. That has everything to do with the actual natural process of the movement of water. And in fact, with it, it's going to be more common when you have city water than when you have actual well water, because the actual pressure levels are going to be much higher. And when you do that, it's going to cause a higher chance for that stuff to separate. That's why when you're going to get the water with it, it's going to show bubbles on the side with it when you actually have it in your glass. That's actually the molecules actually showing themselves on the side of the glass. Now, normally you would have to run some type of electricity through it to actually get that, but because of the situations that it's going through, you can actually get that without it because of the pressure it's being put under. Now, that's why we have some of those crazy ideas. Now, when it comes down to, and that would actually impact people's ability to get food, and this would cause more starvation. Now, when we start looking at the other thing, when we go back to the climate scientists, I believe it was up in Sweden, I believe it was. He was somewhere up there with, I'm not 100% sure. And that's why I do use climate scientists in what I call quotation marks, because they usually like to state things in generalities with when it comes to climate scientists, because technically you would have to be an actual you'd actually have to show some type of specific field that you're in with it, but they usually like to say climate science in an actual generic term, and this is where they're not showing an actual specific area that they're in, and they do this to actually make people think there's an actual field called climate science, and there really isn't. You have several different fields that actually come together to actually make their call of what it would be, such as meteorology and other areas as well with it, from meteorology, oceanography, I think it's oceanography, and other things like study of the ocean, study of the actual weather, study of like the actual land itself with it, and all these other studies would come together, and they make their actual call. So that's why you don't get an actual clear, concise statement. And if you look at real statements out there with it, you're going to find that you're going to find very, very varying statements, and they're not always going to be concise with it. And if they are concise with it, you know that that a thing's been really shopped around for people. And that's why when you look at some of those UN reports, whether those are shopped around for people, because they want to make sure that they're all on the same page, and they only wanted a small amount of people who doubted. Even that so-called 97%, that was only a small amount of people. And I guarantee you could have gotten plenty of people to it. You could have gotten you could have gotten countless thousands of people to make a statement on the case of the status of climate, and is there anything changing, number one, and number two, is there anything to do with humans, that is number two, and number three, is there anything that can be done? And those are the three crucial questions. And what this crazy person has actually suggested is that we start learning to eat human meat. Now, this is something very disturbing. We know that basically there have been cases of kuru from actually eating not only brains, but also sometimes which causes it almost every time. But it's also plausibility if you within a few times with it, it can cause it just by eating the human flesh itself. This would be basically why we should not be consuming our own kind, and it's referred to also as a laughing disease. So we should not be consuming any type of meat from it. It's very, very very bad. It's very unhealthy. And she went on to state that we could also start by consuming our own pets. Now, this sounds like something like what you would do if you were basically living in dire hunger in something like a socialist hellhole, not in places with abundance of food. And this is something in which we need to realize that these ideas should be discounted, because it's looking more like we're talking about basically a very, very disturbing religion rather than an actual thing of science. It's not, as we've shown, it's not based on actual fact. None of it's based on fact. When they're actually showing things such as the people that they're bringing forward with their claim themselves as climate scientists. Well, what field are you in? They're never showing when you have these people that state they support it, they're never showing their field. Well, this is a very, very important thing with it. You have a specific field you're in, And it's not climate science. Climate science is not a field of study. It might be what you're currently studying with it, and what project you're currently on, but it's not an actual field of study. And that's what needs to be understood. Is anybody who says that that's what they are with it, you need to be very, very skeptical of, because it means that they might not want you looking up their credentials. Their credentials could be shown as being very, very suspect to begin with, and that should be something that is very, very disturbing for a lot of people to look up. And we should be looking in the fact that when we see these people that are looking into these that are basically looking into these what do you call it, that when you look into these climate scientists, we should be seeing that they're actually not exactly their credentials might not be exactly what they're stating they are. They might not have graduated as highly as we would assume they should be, and this is why we should be highly skeptical of them. Because if they're stating all this stuff in generalities with it, they might not even be what who they say they are to begin with. Case in point would be when we look at the ideas of what a diplomat should be in politics. When people think of John Bolton claims himself as a diplomat. Well, in actuality, he's nothing but a lawyer. He graduated as a lawyer, and he basically just got himself lucky to get within politics and stuffed in that role of being a diplomat, because there were no other. It was basically a way to stuff another lawyer into the position, and because they wanted basically someone to double talk out there, and really he's nothing more than a lawyer. He has no diplomatic experience, which is why you find that he actually pushes a lot of things of war. And this is why when if somebody asks his credentials with it, he can't go back and state anything. He just basically states, "Oh well, I was appointed as the undersecretary of the UN for an undersecretary of the UN for the U.S. with it." Well, the fact is you don't have to be appointed with it. He's never actually been appointed to an actual position, and we see. And if you look at where he's actually been at, he's been at basically lawyer-based positions in a lot of neoconservative think tanks. That's basically it. That's his actual background, and we need to understand that. And we should do the same type of scrutiny when it comes to actually looking at these climate scientists. If they can't actually show their actual credentials, well, what kind of scientists are you? Well, if you want to show me with it, then I don't believe that you actually have legitimate credentials. And we should actually take their word with a grain of salt, because they're trying to basically push the idea of essentially nothing more than a poll should actually dictate science, and that they want to basically push the idea of actual policy based on theories that have actually been debunked, and basically nothing but polls. Basically, if we're looking at that, that should be considered as quite insane, because that's actually how you actually get into a lot of trouble. If you basically said how many people don't like such and such a country, and basically you got a number of that, how many people were polled on that, and then you made that decision to go to war with them. That would be the utmost insane way of forming policy. Just because you didn't like a country, you decided to go to war with them. Then what you're doing is you're basically destabilizing a whole region just because you took a poll and decided that there were some people that didn't like a single country. That's how you get into a lot of trouble out there. And this is basically what we're doing when it comes down to this, is we're basically taking a poll of how many people think this thing's true without any actual data, because all the data has actually been disproven. Because when we start looking at the actual temperature difference over the last decade, we've actually seen no temperature difference, which is actually shown that, and then all the models that they've produced have been proven false. So, and they've even had to change their actual statements from where they were initially calling it global warming now to climate change. And they basically, anytime some new natural disaster that would normally have happened before any of this talk came up, they would have were basically would have been as a normal occurrence that has happened over millions of years. Now that they want to basically talk about that's actually predated man and actually predated any life on Earth with it, now they want to actually act as if it's something to do with man being on Earth, and that there's some type of impact that we have on weather. And that's the most absurd statement that we can actually make. And we need to realize that that's the product of insanity. And we need to reject any type of things like this, that saying that there's something that we're doing that's controlling the weather. There's nothing that we're doing that's controlling the weather. That's having an impact on weather or natural disasters. If there's an earthquake somewhere, it has nothing to do with what we're doing. In fact, actually, the only thing fracking would actually cause, which would be basically the only thing it would cause, is an actual reduction in the amount of earthquakes, or the actual earthquakes we would be experiencing might be a little slightly more frequent, but of much less magnitude, because it would essentially be releasing pressure. And this is what we need to understand. It doesn't take much of a genius to figure out that when you drill and you're actually pulling something up that's actually causing upward pressure, it's going to cause essentially a release of pressure. And when we do that, it's basically going to be causing less pressure. It's not going to be causing greater pressure when you go down with it, because you have to essentially to get the oil up, it's going to have to come up on its own. We're not actually like pumping it and actually forcing it with more pressure. There's no extra pressure going down. It's just basically enough to actually drill through. Once we have enough to drill through, it naturally comes up. And we're actually doing a standard slight plug on it to this temporary, just so it doesn't squirt everywhere. And then basically we pump the stuff and up, which is actually releasing pressure. That's how an actual oil rig works. We're not basically increasing pressure down there with it. That would be the only way that more earthquakes could occur. I mean, if this were a theory with it, I mean, you'd basically say that any road work could essentially cause an earthquake. Could essentially cause an earthquake, a natural disaster. I mean, based on what theories they're basically stating. And that's why it's the most absurd statements. This is basically because there's a lot of cronyism when it comes down to this, and there's a lot of these, the next new lobby is green energy that's donating in. And they basically want this lobby to be secured, so they need to shut down competitive forms of energy, and to ensure that that the green lobby gets what they want. And that's really what it boils down to. Now, when we start seeing some of these things, we see a lot of these things are very, very disturbing. And it's basically a mix of, you find a lot of these political games that they're playing. Obviously, you have the cronyism through the green lobbying and trying to shut down competitive industries. Um, you'll find, and basically it doesn't mean that not necessarily that industry can't exist, whether they're saying they can't exist in certain countries. Because as we see, people like Tom Steyer are basically, they'll preach against American coal while investing in Chinese coal. And that's pretty much been open for quite some time. And yet he's viewed as this great environmentalist. Well, if he's so great with it, why is he what it calls? Why is he causing pushing for the shutdown of one industry, but but pushing for the opening and expansion of the other, and when it's the same industry? He's never really pushed for the expansion of any of these green energies within the United States. It's merely just pushing for that coal to be changed around. Now, when it comes down to other ones, they're really doing the same thing, or just causing, or is looking to cause unrest. Now, when we start looking at some of the other things, we're seeing that they're basically going into some of these cult-like activities and some of these things that are basically have been pretty much thought of as we thought we would never repeat, that were actually part of the of what the what was happening in communism, and what was happening in throughout a lot of these socialist countries, which is basically just some horrific activities, and we see that they basically want to repeat them over and over again. And I think that's, and basically stating that certain people have certain levels of rights, and I think that's horrible. And I think that when we see that, I think we should basically eliminate those people from the actual debate, because they're basically, all they want to do is basically just drag the world down, basically back another 100 years, and put it essentially into the worst of the worst of that 100 years ago. They want to basically make us like, make the world essentially like the Soviet Union was, and put it into the worst of the worst. And it's not, it doesn't help anybody out. I mean, when they had areas in the Soviet Union, they were basically where people were pushed to cannibalism. That wasn't a good thing. That was a very, very bad thing. That was because of the fact that there was no food, because everything was centralized, so there was no food in areas like Ukraine. It was because Stalin was having everything centralized, and basically he was making sure that basically nothing came about out there. And the thing about all of this eugenics with it, this is basically, that's not a positive thing. That's basically, you're killing off people because you don't believe they have an actual right to exist. And we basically should be denying the actual rights for that, and of those people to exist. And of those types of governments to exist, because the fact is we've gone through those things. No. And that's a problem. And that's something that we need to stop with the with what's going out there with it. I mean, we're essentially taking a step back by looking at this. That's why when we state this thing is an actual religion, and it's essentially really not only not equal to some of the more traditional religions, because it's not even practicing anything remotely sane. It's practicing some of these most insane type of ideas. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure that you share it all the way around. I know this is a live stream, but it will be up very, very shortly. And I will basically end the video right now, and I will see you guys whenever I have time to do my next one. I know I've been a little bit busy, but that's because I've been in the middle of filing the K1 visa for my fiance. That's about it, and I'm done right about now.